And if you have not turned yet to Daniel, go ahead and do that, please. I invite you to pick up the text with me in the place where Ryan stopped. Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12. At that time shall arise Michael the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the stream and one on that bank of the stream. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, "How long shall it be till the end of these wonders?" And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time, that when the shattering of the people, the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. I heard, but I didn't understand. Then I said, "O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" He said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly. And none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days." When I was growing up, my parents would occasionally share information that was just for us kids, that they would not share with the rest of the world, at least not immediately. And some of those times included situations where there was a sibling who was going to be entering our family, and my parents wanted us to be the first ones to know. Or my dad's job, Chevron had decided to transfer us to the next state or the next country, the next location that we were supposed to move to. And they wanted us to be the first ones to know because we were in the family. And that's why we got privileged information. And if you think about it, all throughout time, God has been working with His children, His people, in various ways, with various prophets like Daniel and others, to give His children privileged information about what the plan is for their lives and for the way that God is working in the world. And so this information here that we just have been reading in 11 and 12 is about what God keeps calling 4 different times the time of the end. Which end are we talking about? Are we talking about the end of the Greek persecution of the Jews? Are we talking about the end of the Jewish nation in AD 70 when the Romans come and Jerusalem falls and the temple's destroyed? Are we talking about the end of time, all time, the end of the world? I think the answer is all of the above. Everything is being referenced here in different quantities, in different ways, but they're all bleeding together in the text. There's no clear delineation. Okay, now we're talking about this end, now we're talking about that end. But they all kind of come into a melting pot and make a larger point. That whoever the foe is, whoever the enemy that rises up against God is, however much he persecutes and causes suffering to God's people, he's going down. God's going to make sure of that. and the people of God, who have been thrown under the bus throughout history, are going to rise triumphant and reign with God forever. To a limited extent, that happens in earthly life, but ultimately that's going to happen at the final end, which Daniel 12, I believe, is strongly pointing to. And so, as we come to the end of our study of this wonderful book, and I know that we've been studying this book for many, many Sundays. I appreciate your patience with this study. I have gained much from it. I hope you have too. I think when we come to the end of this, we can be grateful that our God does not keep us in the dark as His children. He wants us to know, as He said over and over thus far, His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom that shall never be destroyed, unlike the Persians, unlike the Babylonians, unlike the Greeks and the Romans and every other kingdom in the world. But that wasn't very clear when Daniel first got this message. You may have picked up in chapter 12, he flat out says to the angels, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't understand. Because the message, he's told a couple of different times, at this point in history is sealed up. It's shut. The message is given, but what the message means has not been revealed yet. But we're going to go to the book of Revelation at the end of the sermon, and we're going to see how in Revelation 5, the message that is at the right hand of God, that has been sealed up with 7 seals, is broken open, and the message is given out, and the judgments are given to those who disobey, and salvation is provided to those who love Jesus. So the time of the end is hard for those who don't love God, but it is exhilarating for those who do. The picture up on the screen is a picture that I took when I went to Jerusalem. This is at the base of the Temple Mount. These stones are lying exactly where they have been lying when they were first thrown down off the Temple Mount by the Romans who were destroying Jerusalem. The archaeologists have uncovered them, and they just left them there intact. And they bear witness, physical witness, to the fact that when God says, through His prophets, that He is coming to judge, to destroy, but also to save, He means what He says. We can take comfort from that as His children. Jesus is the great conqueror of the Scriptures. And so now I want to get into Daniel 12 and 11 and talk about several things, 4 different things that God says He is going to do. We're not going to painstakingly work through, especially chapter 11. You can consult a good study Bible or a commentary that will break down all of those historical events, but I did want Ryan to read it all so that we could be struck by how much God knows about the world history and about His plans before they take place. What was He going to do with the world and with His people? Well, I think generally speaking, kind of a broader point we can make about this is He's going to shepherd His children through a very difficult timeline of world events. To my knowledge, this is the most extensive and detailed prediction of world events in all of the Bible. And so for this reason, many scholars look at Daniel 11 and 12 and they say, well, this shows that it could not have possibly been written during the time that Daniel says that his life is set in. It's got to be written much later after all these things have happened. But we know from reading the rest of the Bible that this kind of thing is nothing new. God has been constantly foretelling future events and getting His children ready to go into certain things and warning them ahead of time. And so we can take stock. We can look at this and believe that it is true. And it provides trust because of what God says here. So chapter 11 covers hundreds of years of history during the time of the Greeks, when there were 2 great empires, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, duking it out on the world stage. and God's people are caught in between. But all of this is revealed to Daniel and his people so that they could understand that they needed to buckle their seatbelts, that it was going to be a bumpy ride ahead. You notice that there are a lot of time references here. I took a highlighter and I underlined all of these things, and my Bible is now covered with markings. Until the time of the end, at the appointed time, for a time. You have numbers at the end of chapter 12, 1,290, 1335. So these numbers are kind of mysterious in some ways, but I think they show a clear point that God wants us to be less concerned about exactly when something is going to take place and more concerned about making sure that we are ready to receive His promises whenever they do come. But, whenever God makes a prediction, what's the first thing that humans want to say? When is this going to happen? And sometimes, how is this going to happen? You remember in Matthew 24, it's talked about in other Gospels too, but Jesus is foretelling the destruction of the temple, and they're sitting up on the Mount of Olives looking down at Jerusalem, and his guys say, what are these things going to take place that you just said that not one stone is going to be left on another? When is that going to happen? And Jesus basically responds with, well, nobody knows. I don't even know. Only the Father knows exactly when that's going to happen. But what you need to be focused on is holding on to the Messiah that you know you have, not being led astray by somebody else, and getting out of this city, this Sodom and Gomorrah, before the fire and brimstone hits it. You remember in Acts chapter 1 when Jesus is about to ascend back into heaven? What is the question that he gets asked by his apostles? When, right? When, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus' response is, well, it's not your job to know the times and the seasons that the Father's fixed by His own authority. What you need to be focused on is sitting tight in Jerusalem for the Spirit to come upon you so that you can get out there and spread the message to all the nations. And you leave the times and the seasons up to me and the Spirit and the Father. I think it's even interesting in chapter 12 here. Did you notice the angels are even asking the when question? So chapter 12, verse 6. Angels calling out to another angel, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And some numbers are given out, but even that's a little bit mysterious. It's not precisely said. And so our job then is not to concern ourselves with predicting the rising and falling of nations, calculating the end of the world. Our job is described in chapter 12, verse 12. You notice what it says? Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the time appointed. This waiting is not talking about sitting around doing nothing. Remember, in the Thessalonian letters, that church seemed to have a problem with doing that. Oh, well, Jesus is coming back, so that means that I don't have to live in the kind of way that He wants me to live. No, we work and pray while we wait, as Daniel has been doing for this entire book, until the day that we stand in our allotted places at the end of the days, until judgment comes and we are rewarded and taken to the heavenly places. So that's one thing that God was going to do. Something else that God was going to do, and He says this several different times, is He's going to provide His people with wise guides during these difficult days. Times of hardship, and the Bible talks about this several different times, times of hardship are like a period of refining fire, where a metal with all sorts of other things is thrown into the flames and the impurities get burned off. Hard times make it clear how we are being foolish and how we might be wise. Who is foolish and who is wise? And all through history, God has sprinkled the nations with people who are wise, who can help point the way out of the darkness and the foolishness. You remember before the time of the flood, you have a horribly wicked time in Genesis 6 that is about as dark as it could possibly get, but Noah and his family shine as lights in that dark time. Do you remember what happens in the Exodus generation? All these people are redeemed from Egypt and their slavery, but they bring all their idols with them, and they have terrible problems attaching themselves to God. And Moses and Joshua are there to serve as wise guides during that time. Do you remember the time of Ahab and Jezebel? About as dark of a time in Israel as they ever had. Idolatry out the nose. Everybody's doing it. Nobody wants to serve Yahweh like he wants to be served. But you have Elijah, who stands alone at Mount Carmel, surrounded by hundreds of false prophets and people who are quick to bow the knee, but not quick to bow their hearts. But Elijah and then Elisha stand as lights in that darkness. And during Judah's decline, right before the Babylonian destruction, you still got Jeremiah, you still got Baruch, you have wise guides all the way through Bible history. And the same is true of these times that Daniel is speaking about. You see in chapter 11, in verse 33, the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. And then in chapter 12, notice verse 3, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Think about being stars for a second. Before radar was invented, before GPS was invented, before we had all this fancy tech and navigational equipment, how did a sailor know where he was sailing when he was out in the middle of an ocean? There's no land anywhere around him. By night, he's going to use the stars. Because the stars, if you can understand the patterns of how they work and where they are, they can be these fixed locations that can help you understand where you're supposed to go and how to orient yourself. They use that light. And so wise people function in that way for the people who are around them. Those are the people, chapter 12, verse 10, who shall understand and help other people understand. So, application point for us. Do you know who these stars are around you? Do you know who is wise? Who understands in your life with the people that you know and have relations with? Wise people are not going to be pushy about their wisdom. Wise people are not going to come up to you and say, "Hi, I am really wise. Did you know that? I think you should just follow me around and do what I do and say what I say. Just absorb me." Wise people are never going to say that. If they ever do, that shows they're not wise. Remember Proverbs 3, verse 7? Be not wise in your own eyes. The wisest people that I know, either in this room or elsewhere, are the kind of people who would say, more than anybody else, I understand how much farther I still need to go in my walk and relationship with Jesus. And those are the people who are wise. So it's up to you and me to find those people, to attach ourselves to them, to cherish them as God's gifts to us, as stars that we can orient ourselves around in our lives. And it is up to you and me to become those stars, to become people that others would look to for understanding and wisdom and strength. To not just have that for ourselves, but to have something to give and offer to others. That's a blessing that God gives to his people. Something else that God's going to do in Daniel 11 and 12 and in this time of the end that he's talking about here, he's going to disgrace those who exalt themselves. This is a familiar tune In the book of Daniel, we have seen this before. We've read stories that show God's amazing ability to take those who put themselves up on pedestals and knock the pedestal off from beneath them so that they fall on their face. You remember, that's Nebuchadnezzar's story arc in the chapters that we have about him. In Daniel 4, in verse 37, that is the last thing that Nebuchadnezzar says in the letter that he writes to the nations. Do you remember back there in the last part of that chapter? He says to his whole nation, his whole empire, those who walk in pride, he, God, is able to humble. And then in the next chapter, in chapter 5, that's the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar's successor failed to absorb. Do you remember how Belshazzar is taking all of the temple things that he has stolen, that the Babylonians have taken from Jerusalem, and they're having this big feast to their gods, and they're praising wood and stone, and they're being fools? Do you remember how Daniel comes in 522, and he looks Belshazzar in the eyeballs, and he says, you, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, what happened to your predecessor, but you've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. What God does with those characters and others throughout the Bible, he does today and he does in the future with men and women who don't get this lesson and put it inside of their hearts. I think the verses in chapter 11 especially are mostly about a king of the Greeks who we have studied about before, Antiochus Epiphanes, is what he liked to call himself. He was a tyrant. He thought himself as divine, as one of the gods. He persecuted the Jews horribly, tried to destroy their culture, tried to destroy their allegiance to God in a lot of ways. He was a monster. But you notice in 1136, it says, he shall exalt himself, magnify himself, speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He's not going to last, in other words. But then you get to the end of chapter 11, and there's some details that don't seem to really fit with any historical king that we have records of. But there's going to be this ruler who's going to conquer and plunder and pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. It seems to represent some sort of ultimate foe or maybe series of foes that the Lord is going to smash, but he is going to smash them because you get to the end part of that chapter, and what's the last line of chapter 11? He shall come to his end with none to help him. We've made this point before in previous chapters. We're going to make it again because it's being camped on again in Daniel. But God hates, really, really hates human arrogance. I think I've mentioned this before, but in Proverbs chapter 6, do you remember in the list of 7 abominations that God says that he can't stand, haughty eyes is the very first phrase of that list. Because God's whole personality, and this hooks up to a comment that Josh made in our Bible class this morning, God's whole personality is oriented outwards so that he's looking out to see who he can help, who he can serve, and pride is the exact opposite. It looks inward to see how can I benefit myself at the expense of other people. Arrogance is, I'm going to do what I do and say what I say regardless of how it affects other people. Did you notice the beginning of 1136? What is this king going to do? He's going to do whatever he wants to do. He and the king shall do as he wills. How many occasions in your life can you point to where you just flat out did what you willed to do? I have many of those occasions on my record. Why do we do that? Well, because we feel entitled, or we feel angry, or we feel lonely, or any number of reasons. But 1136 is a very different tone from what Jesus said to the Father in the garden right before he goes to the cross. I want this cup to pass from me. I'm praying that that would happen, yet not as I will, but as you will. Instead of causing death like Antiochus did, and these other kings that we read about in chapter 11 and into 12, Jesus doesn't cause death. Jesus took on death voluntarily so that we could have life. God help us to be more like that. So he's going to disgrace those who exalt themselves. And a fourth thing that he's going to do is he's going to restore souls. And he's going to raise the bodies of the dead. I want to read in chapter 12, 2 and 3 again. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever. So God is going to spiritually resurrect the nation of Israel. If you go to Ezekiel 37, you look at this valley of dry bones picture that Ezekiel sees, and the bones start clicking together, and flesh starts to come on the bones, and then the Spirit of God enters into these corpses. That was a way to say, I'm resurrecting Israel. And as the gospel goes out, Jesus' message is preached. The nation of Israel, the true Israel, made up of Jews and Gentiles, resurrects. Verse 3, I think, is getting at that idea too, that these wise are turning many to righteousness, these spirit-filled people. But eventually, at the end, bodies are going to be rising from the dead, especially those who respond favorably to the message. God's going to make new bodies for his children. And it's interesting, when you go to the New Testament, even Martha in John chapter 11 understood this. Most of the Jews believed in resurrection, except for the Sadducees, who didn't believe even in angels or in most of the Bible and its inspiration. The average Jew understood that God was going to do this. You remember when Martha is being comforted by Jesus. Jesus is saying, hey, your brother who just died, he's going to rise again. And Martha says, what? Well, I know that he's going to rise again on the last day. How did she know that? Because when you go to the Old Testament, resurrection is not necessarily the clearest teaching out there. There are kind of shadowy allusions to it, like Psalm 16. He will not allow his Holy One to undergo decay. Okay, that starts to get there. You think about Job chapter 19, where Job says, after my skin has thus been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Okay, that starts to get us there. And there are other references too, but Daniel 12 is one of those clear passages, I think, about the coming resurrection. And this is a wonderful promise that has so many implications for our lives. You think about how if your current body has desires that God has said as Christians you should not indulge, well, guess what your new body is going to be like? It's not going to have that swerving of the cart that your body currently has. If you have a disease, if you are tired all the time, if your body is broken, then your new body will be free from that pain. And if you become like these Jews and like the Christians in the first century and onward who are martyred for the cause of Jesus Christ, you will not have lost anything because your body will be restored to you and then changed into a better body than you have ever known before. This gives us a really neat picture of what heaven is going to be like. We're not going to be these disembodied spirits floating around on clouds. We're going to have bodies. And they're not going to be like these bodies, because Paul says in 1 Corinthians, flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God. But they are going to be some kind of body, some kind of better body, Eventually, all suffering will end. Eventually, every mystery will be laid bare because this is the time of the light when all is being revealed to us. And that is one of the biggest messages, I think, from Daniel 11, Daniel 12, and really the whole book of Daniel. That so much is being said to this prophet and to the people who read his book. And at the time that they get these prophecies, everybody's scratching their heads. Nobody really gets it. But you get into the New Testament, and the scroll is broken open. But I do want to notice chapter 12, verse 4. Notice again, you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. And then in verse 9, go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. But what do we find in Revelation 5? We find the Apostle John watching his own heavenly vision in that book, and he sees this scroll written on the front, written on the back, sealed up with 7 seals, and the word goes out from this angel in the heavenly places, who is able to open this scroll? And nobody is able to open it. John starts weeping loudly. He is so hurt and so disappointed by that fact that nobody can touch it. But then one of the angels comes and says, no, wait, John, there is one who can unseal that scroll and break open those seals. It's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And so John looks over, expecting to see a lion, and what does he see? He sees a lamb, and the lamb looks like it had a really, really bad day. It looks dead. It looks slaughtered. But that seemingly dead lamb walks up to the throne and grabs the scroll and just starts breaking all of the seals. And as the seals are broken, what happens? The very kinds of things that Daniel has talked about in his book: judgment on the foes and salvation for the righteous. The message is now open. And what Daniel has said has come to pass. To him was given glory and dominion and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. And that is the kingdom, if you are a child of God, that you are now a part of. Jesus has conquered, as God knew he would, as he said that he would, and he invites all of us now to become a part of this, to take our places in this work that he is accomplishing so that we can stand in our allotted places at the end of the days. And so, if you are not a part of this kingdom, or you need to come back to it, or you need help in some kind of way in your life, please let us know about that as together we stand up and we sing the invitation song.